Resident Evil has been one of the most iconic gaming franchises of all time. Starting out in the 90s, the first 3 Resident Evil games were iconic and groundbreaking entries in the survival horror genre. From there, the series revitalized itself in the PS2 era with Resident Evil 4, being one of the first games to popularize the over-the-shoulder third-person camera. Resident Evil 4 at release was looked at as one of not just the best games in the series, but one of the best games of all time. However, a more action-oriented approach that was introduced in Resident Evil 4 caused Capcom to slightly lose their way, with Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 receiving extremely mixed reviews and reception by not just critics, but audiences alike. However, in 2017, Resident Evil came back with a vengeance with Resident Evil 7. This entry successfully brought the series back from the dead and also brought it back to its roots. Recently, we've also seen Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake also receiving a lot of acclaim, even if Resident Evil 3 was lighter on content than the original release. Now, in 2021, we're seeing the release of Resident Evil Village. It's a direct sequel to Resident Evil 7, and it's building not just on RE7, but also bringing elements from previous entries in the franchise, most notably attempting to recreate some of the magic of Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil Village is definitely one of the most interesting entries in the franchise, and in my opinion, its biggest strength and weakness is its scope. So what do I mean by that? Let's dive into it so I can give you my full thoughts and analysis on Resident Evil Village. As Resident Evil Village is a direct sequel to Resident Evil 7, we start the game back up as Ethan Winters, the protagonist from the previous game. Picking up after the events of Resident Evil 7, we see Ethan settling down with his family in Eastern Europe. However, trouble immediately ensues. Chris Redfield returns after his cameo appearance from the end of the last game. He kills Mia, which is Ethan's wife, and kidnaps their infant daughter. Pretty quickly, you find yourself at the village that gives the game its name. Ethan finds himself in a decrepit village that's overlooked by a towering castle. But if that wasn't creepy enough, many of the residents of the village have become werewolves. Without spoiling too much, Ethan realizes he needs to take on the 4 lords of the village to save his daughter. Ethan's journey to take on the 4 lords will take him not just through the village, but also Castle Dimitrescu, as well as the other houses of the lords, which can range from creepy houses to swamps to factories. Now let's start off with the positive. Because of the village and the different lords, there's a lot of variety on display. And with initial impressions, a lot of these characters and environments come off as really interesting. However, that's as far as I can really go in terms of praise for this game's story. I think this game's story and the narrative that structures this game is this game's biggest downfall, as it has ramifications not for just the story, but also how the gameplay works. Yes, it's nice that there's a lot of variety, but that also means that a lot of the characters aren't fleshed out enough. As so many come and go, you forget completely about them. The highlights of the game are without a doubt Lady Dimitrescu and her entire castle, as well as the second house. From there, the third and fourth houses don't really hold a candle, in my opinion, to the quality that the first half of the game really brings. This is a trope with almost every Resident Evil game where the first half is, without a doubt, much stronger than the second half. And I was really hoping coming into this game that they would alleviate that concern or that issue with the franchise, but it's really shocking at this point, by the 8th mainline entry in the series, that they still haven't worked out pacing and structuring so that the second half of the game doesn't falter. I think the second half of the game loses a lot of pace too. I think the voice acting and the performances are also a complete mixed bag here. The highlight, without a doubt, as I mentioned earlier, is Lady Dimitrescu. Her and her daughters are super interesting and very well performed and well acted. However, after the first quarter or so of the game, Lady Dimitrescu exits the story, and you can really feel her absence throughout the rest of the game. There's also other good performances as well, such as the main antagonist of the game, Mother Miranda, does a decent enough job, as well as the merchant character in the game, the Duke. However, the rest of the cast feels like they're trying to put on a Broadway performance as opposed to voice act in a horror video game. Chris Redfield's actor in this game sounds like he's doing a really bad Keanu Reeves impersonation, and one of the other lords, Heisenberg, doesn't feel like he's giving a proper performance that matches his character's role. And that takes us all the way back to our main protagonist, Ethan Winters. Now, I didn't really have a problem with Ethan in Resident Evil 7. I thought he was a passable, blank slate protagonist that we could inject ourselves into as players. However, in this game, I think he's honestly really bad. He is arguably the worst Resident Evil protagonist in the entire series, and I really noticed how bad some of his lines were. I thought Resident Evil 7 did a really good job of getting rid of a lot of the cringy elements of Resident Evil storytelling, but a lot of that comes back in full force in this game. There's so many times where Ethan just says the most ridiculous sentence possible in any of his given circumstances, and I really noticed how bad of a character he was, and how boring he was, really. I think the story in this game is a really good first example of why scope and ambition is Resident Evil Village's greatest weakness, but also its greatest strength. There's a lot of interesting characters on display, a lot of cool environments, a lot of interesting locales you visit, but besides the first one with Lady Dimitrescu and Castle Dimitrescu, a lot of them either are too short-lived or just fall flat. What happens in return is that I feel like none of these locations or bosses or characters get the proper love and respect that they deserve. There's a lot of interesting ideas and concepts on display, but nothing gets fully fleshed out to the point where it should be. I think expanding so much in scope compared to Resident Evil 7 was a miscalculation. With Resident Evil 7's focus, the Baker family and the Baker residence became iconic locations in the series, as well as one of the most iconic locations in horror games in the past decade. And I can't help but feel that if Capcom took the same approach with Resident Evil Village, deciding to put Lady Dimitrescu and the castle front and center, we would have been able to see the castle become another iconic gaming location. But since it's only a playable location for really the first quarter or first third of the game, I feel like Capcom really missed a great opportunity here. All in all, I think the story of this game is a huge letdown compared to something like Resident Evil 7. I think Capcom really handles stories in Resident Evil as well as locations best when they hone in their scope to a specific location or set of characters. The Raccoon City Police Department in Resident Evil 2 and the Baker family residence in Resident Evil 7 are the perfect examples of this. Those were locations that us as players really knew like the back of our hands because of how much time we spent within them during the course of the game. With Resident Evil Village's expanded scope, none of the locations or the characters get the proper love that they really deserve, especially Lady Dimitrescu and the castle. Now, in terms of visuals, I have nothing but positive things to say about Village. This game looks amazing, and it looks borderline photorealistic at times too, especially on next-gen hardware. I played this game on PS5, and on next-gen consoles, there's two different options for graphics, like always. Here, you get 60 FPS 4K with ray tracing off, or you get 45 frames per second 4K with ray tracing on. Now, as always, I always opt for the locked 60 FPS because I always prefer performance over ray tracing. However, I have heard that if you have ray tracing on, the game does a pretty good job of staying in the 50 to 60 FPS range and doesn't actually drop down to the 45 FPS target that much, which is a great thing to hear. Since the game is in first person, you're also able to get a much closer look at a lot of the things that you come across. The first person camera also does a great job of immersing you in the world. There's so many times when I was walking through Castle Dimitrescu or the village, and I would just be blown away because everything looked so real. I would just stop so many times to just take in the scenery, and it's honestly a sight to behold. And I have to give a great shout out to the design and production and art team working at Capcom, because Resident Evil has been creating some of the best visuals in games recently, and Village is no exception. Now let's get into the meat of this whole thing, the gameplay. Just like Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village is first person. Following the trend of the story's progression, the gameplay here is also very much expanded upon from Resident Evil 7's mechanics. Weapons are now upgradable. This is done by visiting my favorite character in the game, the Duke. He's always in the most convenient of spots, and he always has something interesting to say. When you access his shop, you can sell your current items, you can buy new items like new guns, health potions, ammo, weapon upgrades, or you can also upgrade the base stats of your guns to an upgrade menu. Those upgrades and firepower are really going to be needed in this game though. This game has much more of an action focus than Resident Evil 7. Overall, I will say this game is less scary than Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 was consistently creepy, disgusting, and reminded me of something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, even though this game is overall less scary than Resident Evil 7, I will say the second Lord that you face in this game is without a doubt the scariest thing in the entire series. It totally caught me off guard, and it's something straight out of PT or Outlast. I loved it. I just wish that it went on a little bit longer. Just like there's expansion to gunplay, there's also expansion to exploration. Just like how in Resident Evil 7, the trailer was the hub of the entire Baker residence, in this game, we have a much larger hub with the village. Every time you face a lord, you always come back here to explore new secrets, new routes, and new environments. It was always really fun to come back after a lord to see what new places I could explore with the new keys and new items I unlocked, as well as to see how the environments I passed through a few hours ago may have changed either through new obstacles or new enemy placements. The variety in the story also translates to the gameplay and how the game approaches its four lords. Each of the four lords' residences all play out very differently. However, as I mentioned earlier, I think Lady Dimitrescu and Castle Dimitrescu, which is the first lord and her location, are without a doubt the best in the entire game. Castle Dimitrescu is classic Resident Evil. It's an open environment to explore, And while you're exploring, you're trying to avoid Lady Dimitrescu just like you're trying to avoid someone like Mr. X. Sadly, Lords 2 through 4 are more linear, but I still think the second house is excellent. As I mentioned before, it's probably the scariest that the entire series has ever gotten, and switches up the gameplay by taking away your weapons. Without spoiling houses 3 and 4, they keep the linearity of the second house, but honestly lose some of the creativity, swapping out interesting set pieces and exploration from the castle and village for more enemies, more gunfights, and a lot more linearity. The game just especially gets too action-oriented in the back third. It really feels like the team started running out of ideas here. It's also a shame to mention that Lady D is the only real Mr. X type enemy in the game. So after the first house, or after the first lord, you don't really have that cat and mouse style gameplay that you have like Mr. X in the Raccoon City Police Department. I also have to say that Lady Dimitrescu doesn't really hold a candle to Mr. X. She's honestly really easy to cheese. So let me just try to break it down here. In Castle Dimitrescu, the entire section is based around getting 4 items and bringing them back to the central hub. However, next to the central hub is also the safe room. Now, notoriously in Resident Evil, safe rooms are the one place no enemy can ever reach. And I don't have a problem with that idea. I just think in this game, the safe room in Castle Dimitrescu should have honestly just been put in a better location. Since the safe room is next to where you're supposed to bring all 4 items back to, a lot of times when you run into Lady Dimitrescu or her daughters, it's going to be near that room, and you can always run back to that room and see them stand right outside the door and then slowly walk away, and then just run right to your objective, place the item, and keep moving forward. It really was immersion breaking, and it was the first time that I really started cheesing the pursuer type enemies in this series, which was a letdown. Once again, going back to what I said at the start of the video, ambition is Village's greatest strength, but also its greatest weakness. In gameplay, we see a lot of great expansions to exploration and gunplay. However, that lack of focus you can really feel in the back half of the game. For variety's sake, there's a lot of cool and different environments, but houses 3 and 4 are just sadly not as interesting as 1 and 2. They really should have taken houses 1 and 2 and expanded upon those gameplay elements in those houses. And the lack of interesting gameplay mechanics in houses 3 and 4 are replaced by obnoxious amounts of enemies. There was a few times in the latter half of the game where I wasn't even sure if I was supposed to be fighting certain rooms of enemies because there were so many. It gets that crazy in the second half. And also the last hour of the game feels almost like a completely different game. It gets so action-packed and so action-heavy, it feels like a Call of Duty game. I even told one of my friends after I beat it that certain scenes reminded me of Modern Warfare 2019. Which I like that game, but is not exactly a compliment to what Resident Evil is trying to be. Overall, I think the gameplay has a lot of good additions to it, but it starts to really lose steam because improvements on gameplay are not enough. You need good level design, you need good encounter design, and the back half of this game really doesn't have that. I also think the bosses in this game go on for about 25% longer than they really should. They're total bullet hoses, and they really feel like they're there really just to deplete your supplies rather than to create meaningfully challenging encounters. There's almost no interesting boss fight mechanics in any of the bosses in this game, and there's a lot more than previous Resident Evil games, which is a shame. One final thing I want to talk about with gameplay is the return of Mercenaries Mode. Mercenaries Mode comes back from previous Resident Evil games. It was absent in 7, I believe, but it's back in this one. It's a really fun time trial mode, and it really lets you just goof around with the weapons, and I think it's a really good and fun addition that's bound to add some replayability and longevity. Speaking about the value and length of this game, for me, it only took me about 9.5 hours to beat. However, it's worth noting that Resident Evil is known for being a series that you're meant to replay the game multiple times. For this game, I can for sure say that there's some interesting incentives to go back. There's a higher difficulty that unlocks after you beat the game, as well as a new rotation of weapons that get added to the pool for your second playthrough. I also think Mercenary Mode is a fun distraction that I think some people can find a lot of time to sink into. Overall, I think Resident Evil Village is a little bit of a mixed bag. The gameplay is a really good expansion of Resident Evil 8. The Village is a great setting and a great hub for you to come back to and explore over and over again, and there's a lot of variety on display, from the castles to the swamps to the village to much more that I won't spoil for you. However, because of that ambition and increase in scope, there's a loss of focus. Part of me wishes that Village was almost set entirely in House Benevito and Castle Dimitrescu, and those environments were more fleshed out and more interesting. I really think those could have become classic video game environments, but instead, they're just a small piece of the puzzle in this game. And also, it's sad to say, but the second half of this game just is weaker than the first half. It's just not as interesting, there's not as much freedom, and the game just starts to take a lot more heavier approach on action instead of things that Resident Evil does best, which is exploration and horror. The characters in the story are also just not fleshed out enough, and they're worn too thin because there's so many characters and so many things going on in a 10-hour runtime. I think one trend I've noticed with Resident Evil is that whenever Capcom tries to expand their scope and try to be more epic and large and grandiose, they lose sight of the things that make the series really special, which for me is exploration and the horror atmosphere. Gameplay is not Resident Evil's strong suit, and I'm not trying to play Resident Evil to get my FPS fix, and I don't think anyone is, which is a shame that the second half gets so actiony. Sadly, I don't think this game is as good as Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 really stuck to its guns and had a true vision, and it knew what it wanted to do, and it did that. I liked Resident Evil Village, but I didn't love it like some other entries like 7 or Resident Evil 2 Remake, and there's a reason why I think those games are so well adored. Those games have focus, and they really flesh out the settings and environments and characters and overall feeling of dread. I hope with the next Resident Evil, Capcom is able to control their ambitions and really focus in. When Resident Evil is at a smaller scale, that's when it's at its best. Here's hoping that they learn from their missteps in Village and can create another truly great Resident Evil in the future. Final score, 7.5 out of 10.